Hello, hello. I just wanted to take a minute out of the day to talk through an idea I've been playing a little bit with recently with respect to political polarization and what might give rise to this polarization from a very deep physical level, from the perspective of eternal structures of the dynamics of our not only our politics but actually the same physics that govern the fundamental structures of our reality, and question maybe whether or not there's a linkage there, whether or not there's a symmetry between these two different layers that we often think are quite separate, and we might not necessarily connect those dots in our day-to-day lives, especially in the usual context of political discussion that really doesn't take the time to go down to those really deeper fundamental structural levels to question what is actually going on here. Why are we actually ending up in these polarized states? What is driving it? Not even just from a human perspective, but actually from a perspective that underlies the human condition itself. Are there elements of fundamental reality, of the interactions that take place in nature, in physics, in chemistry, that could perhaps give us some insight into the way that we also end up structuring our group associations and framing our narratives and our dialogues? And can that give us insight? Can that perhaps shed some light into the structures or the paths out of the current positions in which we find ourselves today, in which we find ourselves divided and polarized and unable to communicate again, across these divides? And so I've been thinking a lot about this, and one of the things that painted a very interesting portrait in my mind. Sometimes I have these visual flashes when I'm speaking with people about particular ideas, and an image will just pop up in my mind, or an image that they're describing will map to something else that I've been thinking quite a bit about. And I had one of those in my discussion, or in Brian and I's discussion on our Catalyzing Coherence channel. When we spoke with Garrett Lisi, and Garrett is for those of you who don't know or didn't watch that, first I would say it's a great interview, so definitely watch it. It's over on the Catalyzing Coherence channel. But if you didn't watch it, Garrett is basically a mathematician and theoretical physicist. He was responsible for using a geometric structure by the name of E8 Lie group, which is kind of like a geometric mandala-like structure, if you will, that describes the relationships, or at least he posits it can be used to describe the relationships between fundamental particles in our universe. And in this conversation, when we were talking about this model, we were also talking about the type of implications it had for theories like the Big Bang, theories like that involve the beginning of the universe, why time feels like it has a direction. And when we were talking about the directionality of time, he brought up an idea about the earliest moments of the universe in which there was hypothetically this immensely symmetrical state, perfectly symmetric state before the Big Bang. And that state went through a process called spontaneous symmetry breakage. So something led to the breakage of that symmetry. Perhaps it took a lot of energy to maintain that symmetry. Perhaps it was just a fragile state to begin with. But that symmetry broke, and as soon as that symmetry broke, the entire universe effectively unfolded. And then he compared it to this idea of if you stand an arrow on its tail and then you let gravity do its work, it'll pick a direction and fall, and then you have time basically going along this axis. And that's this idea of spontaneous symmetry breakage. And he also brought up a really interesting visual, and this is the one or an interesting idea, or a kind of a visualization technique to imagine what we're talking about. And it was the visual of a sombrero. And the sombrero, obviously, I think most of us have an idea of what a sombrero looks like in terms of its structure. You have a high point in the center, and then it basically falls down around that center point on all sides. And so you can imagine that supersymmetry state, or that highly symmetric state, being the top of the sombrero, the very pinnacle of this sombrero. And imagine putting a ball on top of that sombrero. Well, what's going to happen? That ball is going to perhaps stay balanced for a very short period of time, but eventually you're going to have a spontaneous symmetry breakage, quote unquote, and the ball will roll down into the bottom of the sombrero, and it will come to rest somewhere in the brim of the hat, so to speak. And so that is also, you can kind of look at that as moving from a state of high potential energy to a state of low potential energy, from a state in which that energy was, there's a very delicate symmetry to which it was a fairly robust condition at the bottom. Obviously, the ball can move around the bottom of the sombrero, it can move around the brim of the hat, but it's not necessarily going to just spontaneously roll back up the hill, whereas it can very easily spontaneously roll down the hill. So that imagery, even though he was applying it to the notion of the beginning of the universe, that same imagery kind of sparked something in me with respect to political polarization and human psychology with respect to engaging in our engagement in different perspectives, different frames, different stories that we use to describe our reality, our own personal reality, but particularly our political reality. And what I was thinking is that this notion of being at the top of the sombrero, this state of extremely high symmetry, this fragile state in which it maintains quite a bit of, or it requires quite a bit of energy to stay at the top of that sombrero, is quite a bit like the state of trying to remain without ideology. It's the state of trying to remain open to new information and balanced in one's perspective, taking in as much information as possible and using the tools that we have, the cognitive tools that we have, the information and the cultural tools that we have around us to hopefully try to constantly reshift one's balance to stay in a position of greater potential energy, where you basically are dealing with the world in a maximally complex way in some respects. You're dealing with all the finite details, all the small, high granularity structures of reality that are quite complex and often frustrating to deal with. And it's not a surprise that people don't necessarily enjoy being in this state. This is the state of the raw exposure to the chaos of reality. It is you are closest to the least known parts of the universe. You do not have an a priori framework to just apply on to everything that you see, and therefore you don't have an easy mapping between what you see in some pre-constructed set of symbols that you can easily categorize, or you can easily dump your experiences into. So you don't have those buckets already formed where you can say, oh yeah, there's somebody talking about taxation structure with respect to the income of people who have a large amount of money. I don't have an a priori framework if I don't have an ideology, if I'm constantly trying to reevaluate what the actual implications of that taxation framework are. And I'm constantly trying to stay at the very pinnacle of that sombrero, then it's quite frankly exhausting, and perhaps even to some extent it could be not necessarily entirely productive if you're never willing to transfer experiences or new complexity into some more stable symbol, some more stable pattern or heuristic that we use to sort of lower the complexity or lower the dimensionality of all of these experiences that we have otherwise. And so from that perspective, it seems to me as if we do find ourselves in this state in which maintaining a position at the top of the sombrero doesn't necessarily confer as much of an adaptive benefit as perhaps a much lower energy state at the bottom of the sombrero. So basically, if I can give you a reason, or if I can give you an a priori framework to interpret reality, and it works 80% of the time, is that enough for you to subscribe to my ideology? Or maybe even, it's only 80% of the time if you try it out enough times. Let's say the first 10 times you apply my ideology to the world, it works. And so you think, wow, like this is actually an entirely an entirely capable map of the world, entirely capable category system for interpreting all of the chaos in a much simpler, much lower resolution plane. But the issue with that is that invariably things do happen in the tails. That 80% is actually, while it might be sufficient for some set of experiences, for example, the libertarian perspective might be well adapted to an ecosystem in which the overall body politic has shifted too far towards the needs of the collective, or the rights of the collective, or the whims of the collective, and therefore there might be some adaptive utility in taking a much stronger stance on the side of the individual, or the destruction of the larger organizations around you, the bureaucratic organizations, the state organizations. So you might have this libertarian language, or this libertarian position that is far more adapted, or far more sensitive to those elements of reality, and therefore seeks to explain those elements of reality through its own lenses in a way that explains a large amount of what they see from a particular perspective. And it's a low energy state. It doesn't necessarily, once you've downloaded the software, once you've read the books, once you've basically once you've got your economics on lock, once you've actually thought through the implications of taxation policy through the framework of looking at any government action as violence, not just as an action on behalf of the entity to which we've delegated the right of eventual violence, but every action of that system as violence. Once you've taken on that framework, once you look at everything through that lens, then you not only don't necessarily have to do the work of interpreting reality in real time, you also have a built-in community. Down at the bottom of the Sombrero, you have a little tribe. And that's also another part of this model that's quite interesting, which is at the bottom of the Sombrero, you have different tribes who have fallen off the perceptive peak, if you will, into these lower energy states, or these lower energy interpretive frameworks. And they resist one another as well. You could kind of think of them as having magnetic forces, and in the same way that magnets can either attract or repel, certain aspects of the low energy consolidation ideologies will attract or repel one another. And so you can imagine that over time, what would happen if you basically take the Sombrero that's like this and flip it towards you. So now we have a circle right here, and you can see the circle, and so you have all these different ideologies who have fallen to the bottom of the Sombrero into a circle. If you look at what's going to happen there, if you factor in the repulsive and attractive dynamics that are going on, you're going to start to see sorting technologies, or sorting patterns, some of these self-sorting behavior, if you will, and these different ideologies will start to cluster. And as they start to cluster, they'll probably cluster along their primary, most strongly interpretive dimensions. And at that moment, when these ideologies cluster around their more strongly interpretive elements, what emerges from that dynamic is most likely going to be something that is a far lower number of parties over time. So you'll get a clustering around something like the left-right divide. And the left-right divide does seem to map at a very fundamental level upon this order and chaos dichotomy. And you have the right, who is this basically, and I hate to use this terminology because I fundamentally believe that we need to move away from this terminology of left and right. But over time, what we do see is a mapping, eventual mapping of all of these different perspectives, all of these different low energy perspectives shift over time, realign, create alliances, engage in conflicts, and sort themselves out into a structure that conforms to perhaps what is the primary underlying dimension of complex adaptive systems, which is this tension between whatever the individual agent at a given layer of the system happens to be, and the emergent structure of the collective and the needs of the collective that form around them. And so you therefore effectively regress to this one-dimensional spectrum, this one-dimensional tension. So we've had two steps at this point. We first started in a symmetric state of high energy where you're able to have an open frame to all new information without applying any a priori ideology, which is a very difficult position to maintain, especially in perpetuity. And also perhaps not as adaptive because A, you're spending a lot of energy, and B, you are also not really encoding that information that you're taking in into an interpretive framework whatsoever. You're kind of trying to stay on the edge of potential, on the edge of potential perception. We've gone from that position, we've fallen into this array of many different low energy hypotheses, is probably a good way of thinking about it. And over time, those low energy hypotheses that may have been sensitive to very specific dimensions of their unique experiences eventually cluster or polarize around the fundamental or primary dimension that drives the evolution of complex adaptive systems, which is this generative tension, or this tension between the individual constituents of any collective. And so there's a tension between the collective and at the higher order and the individual components that comprise the collective at the lower order. And that seems to be what we see with respect to the aggregation or agglomeration around what we call the left and the right. And it seems to be highly adaptive in the sense that, well, we have conserved the adaptive pattern of sensitivity to chaos and order, to individual and collective, to inside borders, outside borders, or open borders, closed borders. These all map onto this fundamental tension. And so while we have conserved that, we might be now over-optimizing for that. Because remember, what we're at the end of this process of first symmetry breakage and then clustering into two parties or two perspectives consolidated around the one primary dimension of reality that we are now focusing on. But that's not the only way of interpreting reality. As we saw back up at the top of the sombrero, there were many other ways of interpreting reality. But why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we? Why don't we make a pilgrimage back up to the top of the sombrero? Why don't we send some explorers back up to the top of the mountain to bring back information so that we might de-aggregate these two perspectives, these two very limiting perspectives on the left and on the right, and then reintegrate or reincorporate new information so that we can form a better configuration for our political systems. We can form a more dynamic whole capable of the problems beset us in the 21st century. Well, why don't we do that? It seems like it would be a good idea, doesn't it? I mean, I think it would be a pretty wonderful idea. I think it's actually necessary if we wish to survive the coming century or the rest of this century. And I'm very serious about that. I really don't think we will survive unless we actually effectively de-aggregate this polarization or break up this two-party frame and reintegrate a far more effective frame or interpretive frame of a much higher capacity or higher dimensional perspective. And so why don't we do it? Well, it seems that we also, along with the people in the bottom of the sombrero, we have created mechanisms that actually profit from that polarization. So those mechanisms, obviously, there are many. The party systems themselves create an inertia, media systems based on monetizing the heat or anger that is generated by maximal division, which would be the state of only two perspectives on the extreme opposite sides of the bottom of the sombrero. That's actually perhaps the most profitable and predictable dynamic to experiment with or to exploit as someone who wishes to generate revenue off of whatever, off content, off of publications, off of stoking the flames of people's emotions. And so we've created so many incentive structures that actually chain us down to the bottom. And anybody who tries to break out of that mold, anybody who tries to go back up to this center point, is perceived as a traitor to both sides. Is perceived as someone who is not realistic or not pragmatic, or doesn't understand why. Doesn't understand the fact that it has always been this way. There has always been this left and right, which is not true at all. That was certainly not a permanent. It's not a permanent fixture of our political landscape by any means. So it's part of a dynamic process, and what we need to understand is that we have a necessity to escape that two-party structure or that unidimensional end state. We're kind of trapped in this unidimensional end game that may have been an adaptive frame for the majority of the evolution of, for example, the United States, but it's quite obvious that in our new world, this is no longer an adaptive frame. This will no longer work. It is no longer sufficiently capable of taking in new information and applying a interpretive framework that leads to increased prosperity, growth, and subjective well-being for an increasingly large percentage of our world, and increasingly seems like it's moving the other direction into increased existential risk. We'll just leave it at that. And because of that dynamic, we are stuck. We're stuck in a place that feels increasingly untenable. We're stuck in a place that feels increasingly frustrating, that feels increasingly isolated, that feels increasingly psychotic almost, perhaps, on Twitter or on CNN or in the newspapers, the New York Times. We see stories that apply a frame to our reality that doesn't actually facilitate any growth, that doesn't actually facilitate that journey back up to the top of the hill, to the top of the Sombrero. We don't treat those who come back from that position with useful information as heroes. We treat them most of the time as enemies, trying to undermine or invade our own political encampment, trying to break down our pre-existing belief structures. And we do not like that, because those belief structures are the things that shield us from the immense complexity of reality. Unbridled, uninterpreted exposure to the unknown state we are increasingly creating for ourselves through the creation of new technology, through the creation of new social structures, through the evolution of our culture in general. These are all generating unknown aspects of our daily lives by the kilo, by the ton, it's hard to say just how many aspects of our daily lives are new. I'm speaking at the speed of light to who knows how many people. And there are economic entities who, between the time that I make this and you see this, will have run algorithms on the content to try to understand how to actually facilitate and channel this information to other people. And that creates other games on top of that fundamental game. And people play those games every day. That plays out on Twitter or Facebook in the comment sections. And we have conversations, not necessarily to get to the bottom of an issue or to really interpret a new perspective, but instead to display dominance or to show how much we've read or how much we know or how well we've adapted or how well we've mapped our lives to the ideas that the group around us believes are true, right? It's like, it's hard to go against the people around you. It's hard to say things that might be new, that might be needed, and yet might also isolate you from those you care about, and not even from those you care about. Beyond that, to say anything new in a world in which everything new is increasingly picked apart for any specific phrase that might be used to justify a pre-existing ideology, because whatever that ideology, whatever interpretive frame they hold as dear or hold as their their primary modus operandi, their primary way of acting in the world, their primary structure for understanding and evaluating what is valuable, what is to be lauded, and what is to be hated. If anything that you say goes against that, or even not even goes against it explicitly in your own mind, but is even heard to contradict what these people are believing, or what they do believe, you can have your entire life destroyed very quickly. Your entire life can fall apart. Somebody can use that and promote that in their own narrative, their own agenda, and in so doing also perhaps make a nice little profit. And so the cycle, the merry-round goes round and round and round, and it's, that is effectively this dynamic that we feel when we're kind of swirling the bottom of the sombrero. We're kind of in our polar opposite camps, rotating around each other at the bottom of this much larger structure, entrapped in this dynamic and trying to break out. We're trying to break out every day with every, well, maybe not all of us, but many of us are trying to break out. Many of us see that it's insanity. Many of us have attempted the same thing over and over and over again, to increasingly chaotic results. If you look at our election cycles, if you look at our presidential candidates, if you look at our current president, if you look at any of our past presidents, not any of our past presidents, I'd say for the past 30 to 40 years perhaps, you see this pattern playing out in which we actually seem to have less and less of a causal connection between who's the president and the direction of our actual future country. It's like we don't have the inbuilt hardware and software in our evolutionary structure to recognize that the world has gotten far too complex for a single primate to direct. It makes no sense. It's absolutely insane to think that, given the inertia of all of the systems, even just take one branch of the military, even take one ship in the Navy, and think about the immense complexity. Think about all the things that can go wrong there, and then imagine the fact that we've taken a billion times that much complexity and nested it all underneath one individual with the hopes that they're going to be able to steward that ship, that emergent ship of state, in a way that actually reflects the vibrant underlying evolution of the society in question. And to think of it this way is to see the true absurdity in this pattern, is to see the way that our inertia, our path from small groups in which perhaps maybe it did make a bit more sense to prioritize the centrality of authority over the dynamism or the perspective or the needs of a bottom-up information gathering system. Perhaps that was more adaptive, and it certainly almost certainly was more adaptive throughout much of our evolutionary history. But as we've increasingly scaled our societies, that's increasingly less true. And so I find myself coming back to this model and thinking that it is a really good way of thinking about why we've polarized and how we polarize, like from a very deep fundamental level, and using it as an interpretive frame to talk about why we need to go back to that center point, go back up that hill in a place that is difficult to stay. We probably don't necessarily want to stay there for very long, but we need to go back up to the top of the mountain, so to speak, and really rethink a lot of elements of our society. Maybe not from the ground up. I mean, we do have much of our infrastructure, much human thought has been quite beneficial, and obviously we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't want to, also throw the wheat, away along with the chaff. But what we're doing now is not going to work, and we need better frameworks. We need better tools for understanding why it's not working. I think this is one of those tools. I think this Sombrero model allows us to understand that it's a dynamic process of going back up to the point of extreme exposure to the finer grained reality of our world, getting the data, gathering the new information, going to the city walls and looking out into the forest, exploring to understand what's going wrong from a perspective, from an open perspective, from a perspective that doesn't impose its a priori beliefs upon what it's seeing for the first time. Because if it's imposing its a priori beliefs upon whatever it's seeing, it's not going to be seeing them for the first time. That's fundamentally, this is kind of like the eyes of, seeing things through the eyes of a child. That's why we have terminology like that, because we understand that the process oftentimes of growing up is this process of falling down into these lower energy states in which we fall into patterns, we fall into habits, we fall into religions, we fall into communities that tell us how the world is, and they give us a story. And those stories are essential in many ways for us to interpret reality, to interpret morality, to interpret value, to actually lay over the landscape of potential some sort of grid of understanding that you can actually walk upon, that's actually treadable, that doesn't just give way to a sea of chaos immediately when you step on it. But that being said, there are times when we need to melt the ice. There are times when the structures have become so rigid, have become so polarized. And not only polarized, but then also the polarization has become monetized and therefore locked in. There are these times when we need to understand that the fundamental necessity of our age, of our time, is to reascend those peaks, to climb back up to the top of this perceptual sombrero, if you will, and to look back out over the landscape and to come back with new ideas, new modes of thought. And that's what I've been thinking about quite a bit recently, and that's where this whole catalyzing coherence project comes in. We've been doing some really wonderful interviews and publishing them on our channel recently, or we've done some recent interviews with some really amazing people that are going to be coming up soon. Currently getting the editing on those right now. We'll be publishing them. Andrew Hessel was a really interesting person. He's a synthetic biologist. We have an interview with him coming up that's going to be published soon. Melissa Lavsky, she's a content strategist, storyteller, previous writer for publications like the New York Times, amongst others, worked on Facebook for various strategic initiatives in terms of branding and the intersection of culture and technology. We actually did a storytelling workshop with her here in San Francisco, which was really, really wonderful, went really well. And we also last week spoke with Jason Silva, which was a really cool experience. And got to meet him, got to hang out with him a bit, really inspiring individual. And that's going to be coming up as well. So that's a really cool conversation. And the whole point of all these conversations is to go back up to that top of the sombrero. Like, we're having conversations that are at this singularity of symmetry, at this point of coherence, trying to seek a place in which new information can shine forth through conversation and make its way back into the stuck and overly structured, polarized landscape of the left and right, and perhaps explode those paradigms a little bit, perhaps dissolve their constraining or constricting exoskeletons, and unleash the potential of all of the individuals who are now trapped within them, who are now bound to these ideas, these political religions, and find the seeds, find the information that can unlock, find the keys that can unlock those chains, if you will, the structures that have either metastasized or crystallized around people's perception, around people's ability to see the world for the first time, to see the world again with new eyes. Because the world is changing, the world is constantly updating, constantly shifting under our feet. And if you bound yourself to the Democratic Party, or if you bound yourself to the Republican Party, or if you bound yourself to libertarian ideology, or if you've already bound yourself to this crypto decentralization world, if you've bound yourself to that, if you've dug your feet in and you're no longer willing to interpret reality through any other frame, then you might as well be imprisoned. You might as well be chained to a particular perspective. And that seems to be inadequate. It seems to, in our world of increasing complexity, in a world where the majority of our problems are becoming global problems, in a world where we are all fundamentally connected at the speed of light, even though we still speak different languages and have different cultures and have different perspectives, being chained to an interpretive framework, being chained to one position, being chained to one lens into reality, it's just not going to work. There's absolutely no way that inflexible, that low dimensional of a representation can possibly hope to perceive, interpret, and act upon the world in a way that is up to the task, is up to the challenges set before us in this century. So some really good interviews coming out that I think are going to help with that. We are beginning to put on some really cool events as well. If you're in San Francisco, August 24th and 25th, we're going to be doing a really amazing event at the intersection of art and decentralization, trying to figure out how decentralized protocols and technologies can be built to help the art community, to serve this community that creates an immense amount of value for humanity, but is often not necessarily rewarded in proportion to the value that they create. That's going to be a really cool event. So keep track of that. Subscribe to Catalyzing Coherence for more information there. We'll keep you updated. And yeah, if you have any questions or if you want to talk at all about this weird sombrero theory, I know it's a little bit out there. I know there's a lot of difference between fundamental physics and the political realm, but I think it's a really interesting or useful interpretive framework or interpretive structure to begin applying to this. And I know I've already been rambling a little bit here, but I'm going to wrap up because I don't want to keep on repeating myself. But if it's an interesting idea to you, let me know. I'd love to talk more about it. Have a good day. Peace.